The views, information, and opinions expressed during the following program are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent the views of Access Communications, its representatives, or its employees.
Welcome to Planting Seeds, Philanthropy in Saskatchewan, a show where we aim to connect you to the donors and charities making an impact across the prairies. I'm your host, Victor Roman Morrow with the South Sask Community Foundation, and I hope you enjoy the show. I'm glad to be joined today by Jacq Brasseur, who's the CEO and founder of Ivy and Dean Consulting, who do a wide range of work, I know focused really on the 2S LGBTQ+ audience, and a lot of unique services, and I think important services to the nonprofit sector. And, you know, this show is all about uplifting the nonprofit sector, highlighting the nonprofit sector, but also I think what's important today is we can look from a business standpoint of, you know, how from a business can you actually be involved and focused on the nonprofit sector. That's part of why I invited you on today, and I know that you're just a great individual, so welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Victor. Yeah.
Is there anything else you want to let people know about your background as we get into this?
I don't think so. Maybe just, you know, a big part of our business, a big part of Ivy and Dean, I think, is this commitment to home. And so while I am, you know, and I say that, it's a little ironic, I'm not from Saskatchewan originally, but my parents are. Yeah. And so I used to spend my summers in Saskatchewan, and my parents moved to Saskatchewan from Yellowknife up north in the 80s, but they grew up in Saskatchewan. So Saskatchewan for me just very much feels like home. It feels like a place that I have a responsibility to. And I think that that's something that folks who work in the nonprofit sector can understand, right? This like sense of big responsibility to your community, to the organization you serve, to the populations that you serve. And so I think that that's a really big part and focus of my company and why I decided to start it.
That's great. I mean, yeah, when we talk about community, I mean, we're talking about, I'm from the Community Foundation, so community is really what we are built on and what we hope to work with people to further. And you kind of mentioned just being community focused.
Yeah.
Like, I guess it's not always a given that everyone is community focused. I mean, a lot of people are, and I think a lot of people find passion in the community in ways that they maybe don't even know. But what is it that maybe made you passionate about your community? And I know that your company works both in Yellowknife and in Saskatchewan. So I guess, what's your why? Why are you passionate about
that's a really
community?
Great question. Well, I think I think as a lot of young people are, I was voluntold by someone back home when I was a teenager to get involved. And so I initially got involved sort of for the first time in like advocacy or activism or community work when I was 17 years old. And then shortly after that, the sort of my old mentor from when I was a kid said, you know, there was a lot of hate rising about LGBTQ people at the time, and she saw that, and so she sort of found me, this like baby activist, and said, hey, I think we should do something, and I think that you could easily, you know, sort of pull a vision together. And so I co-founded my first nonprofit organization when I was 18 years old with another young person in Yellowknife at the time. And my girlfriend now likes to make jokes sometimes. She makes this joke about how I founded 2 nonprofits while she was in the bathroom. And that's sort of like this but that was the beginning of, I think, my love and commitment towards nonprofits. I think seeing the role that they play in uplifting community and in providing a space for community. And then ever since then, I think I just, I sort of, I volunteered for a really long time in nonprofits. And I think at one point my mom, when I was in college, said to me, you need to stop volunteering. Like, you're just doing it too much. And I said, one day, Mom, that this is gonna become a job. Like, I know I can talk my way into like a salaried role somewhere.
Yeah.
That's not quite what happened. I got funding for an organization that I had founded and served as that agency's first executive director. But yeah, I think that's my why, I think, in terms of why I got involved in the nonprofit sector. And since I finished working specifically in the LGBT community nonprofit sector, I've just found a love, I think, of supporting the work of nonprofit leaders. And I think, you spoke earlier about the role that business plays in that. And I think that's a really important part that I think a lot of folks don't think about. But I think as a business owner, I have a responsibility to my community in the same way as nonprofit leaders do. And I think too often the mindset, I think, of folks in business is my business, right? Or sort of this more of sort of an individualistic, or just sort of, they see sort of their business in a vacuum, but then that's what they have a priority to. But when the nonprofit sector is thriving, my business is going to thrive. And if my business thrives, I have a responsibility to pay back or to support the sector. And so we do that in a wide number of ways, including, I think, how we connected originally through hosting a conference. And we also offer like pro bono services to Black, Indigenous, and racialized led nonprofits, to nonprofits or nonprofit projects led by young people under 18. And so we do a lot of work in community, and for us, that's about we have a responsibility to community, just as anybody else who's a member of like the world.
What I really like about your approach is that, I think, there's kind of two things. Like, one thing I wanted to touch on is you mentioned, kind of in the business world, I think it's the expectation, and we live in a capitalist society where the idea is about growth, right? And I even remember myself when I worked in the private sector. There was a moment where when I shifted to the nonprofit sector, part of the reason why is because I was kind of thinking like, what am I trying to achieve here? And at the time I had, a new family, and I was thinking a lot about kind of the purpose of my life. And all I could think of really at the end of the day was like, I'm trying to get a higher paycheck. I'm trying to get more money. And then I kind of sat back and thought like, what does that mean? And and is that actually the most important thing? Like, are there other paths to take? And I think, your business is ingrained in the nonprofit sector. I can also speak personally that as soon as I joined it, it's like, you don't want to leave this, like, because you say that you feel more connected to your community. The work that you're doing, obviously, it's still to sustain itself. There's still a growth aspect there, but when you're bringing the community along with you and you're trying to grow the nonprofits, which are also like strengthening your community, it's all entwined in such a much bigger purpose. And I think that's really important, and I can see that coming through in the way you're talking. Sense of purpose.
I think even that idea of growth is so fascinating. There's a really phenomenal resource from Anti-Racism Works, or that was adapted by an organization in Montreal called the community, called COCO. I forget what it stands for, but it's this really amazing resource challenging white supremacy in organizations, and the way in which I think nonprofit organizations, or really just any kind of organization, really like replicate these systems of violence. And I think one of those things is deeply tied to capitalism, which is this idea of like growth, right? Sort of this like, you need bigger, right? And more. And we see that with nonprofits, with accessing funding, right? It's like they want to know, funders want to know how many people did you serve, and how many efficiencies did you find, or how many and again, it's this idea of growing and more. And I remember when I worked in the nonprofit sector, how frustrating that was for my staff, who saw, and me as the person who's seeking funding, I need to make certain promises to funders, but then it got so frustrating for my staff because the growth that they were seeing was not necessarily growth in size. it was growth in intensity of relationships. It was growth in terms of like personal growth of the people we served. It wasn't necessarily bigger. And sometimes actually we saw the most growth when we got smaller in terms of size. And so I started an activity with them where anytime that we got a new grant or we had sort of our funder outcomes, right? Like what are the things that our funders need from us? Yeah. But then, and that's how they'll, deem something as successful or not. But what about us? What are the things that we will, how we will deem this successful? And that often led to growth, sort of, growth outcomes, like how many LGBT people were we able to give money to, whether in, hiring them to perform at something or, and so, or, how many young people did we see connecting with someone new? And those are not things that, that you can put in a funding report necessarily. And so I think for my business, when I talk about growth of my business, and even, I think trying to practice values of anti-capitalism or trying to mitigate the harms of capitalism as a business owner, I think is complicated. But for us, as we think at our company about what growth means, it isn't only, how many clients did we get this year or how many, what were our sales this year? Yeah. It's more, I think, for us about the relationships we built, the personal growth that we see in our team, and I think the growth of the sector itself as well, and that we are, I think we consider ourselves a part of the sector, even if we're not a nonprofit ourselves. And while I've quickly learned that you can't run a business the way you run a nonprofit, which I guess makes sense because I used to always tell business people that they couldn't run a nonprofit like a business. Yeah. So I guess I should have known. But I do think that the nonprofit sector, there's a lot of things that being a nonprofit sector leader taught me that I brought into my business, and I think that's those unique values, right, of community and growth, but not in a capital. Anyway, all of those complicated pieces, I think, have definitely shaped the way that I do my work.
Oh, that's great. Maybe let's go into a little more detail of like, what are the things, like what is Ivy and Dean? What does it do and how does it serve the nonprofit sector?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So, well, I think the first thing I'll say is, often when I introduce our company to people, they go, "Who's Ivy? Who's Dean?" And I am neither of those people. But I named my business after my grandmother. Her name was Ivy, and she spent most of her life in Outlook, Saskatchewan. And my mother's last name is Dean. And so I named my company after two women who were these matriarchs in my family who taught me about community, who taught me about progressive values, who taught me about equity, and who were also kind of like some pretty ambitious, sometimes a little scary women. And so I think I bring those values into the work that we do, and I like to say that we're a jack of all trades kind of company, and we really focus on serving the nonprofits, on small and medium-sized nonprofits. So most of our clients have budgets of under $500,000 a year. They're often like 1 or 2 or 3 staff members. They don't have the expertise or it's often not even expertise, it's often capacity. They don't have the capacity internally. They don't have, a designated comms person. They don't have a designated finance person. So it's often someone who themselves has to be a jack of all trades. And we just offer generalist consulting services around nonprofit leadership or nonprofit development. I think we sort of found the things that people, I think it's often just through word of mouth, right? Like, who did you get to help you with this thing? When you sort of ask, when you're an executive director, you ask someone else who is an executive director. And so We found ourselves doing a lot of strategic planning work, a lot of policy work. So we've developed what we call a values-based policy development process that's quite different than your traditional, send me policies, I'll rewrite them, and then I send them back to you. We really ingrain our values and the values of our clients into those policies and get them thinking critically about how are your values showing up in the policies that you're adopting. And then we do a lot of board development and board like governance development and training. And you mentioned earlier focusing or doing a lot of work around the LGBTQ community. I think often what we see ourselves doing is we do a lot of work. I think just because of our company being LGBTQ owned and led, we do a lot of work around LGBT inclusion within different sectors, but we also do a lot of work totally unrelated to LGBTQ communities. And I think that for all of the things that we do, I say we're not an equity firm. People often come to us and say, can you do like an equity audit? We don't do necessarily that kind of work. But what we do is we ensure that everybody who works on our team has a significant understanding of equity, diversity, inclusion, of anti-oppression, of anti-racism, of anti-ableism, all of those pieces. And so that when we're coming in to do board training with you, we're teaching you about the Nonprofit Act and the way that you need to make sure that you're following those rules. But we also talk about how does the traditional board structure maybe impact low income people from participating, or how can we shift our board practices to be more inclusive so that the people we serve have the time to sit on boards. And so those are the kinds of things that we bring into that work. And I think that that's why a lot of organizations come to us, is because, well, they need someone who's good at governance, but they don't want to have to teach that somebody about their values as an organization. They want someone who already understands what racism is. And so we've found a really phenomenal community. I mean, the clients that we work with do really incredible work, and we love uplifting their work. And I think that building that reciprocal relationship where, we help them, but they help us just as much as we support them.
And then everything you just said too, just about those pieces, especially around leadership development and board development. I don't know, people that have volunteered a lot or have been in the nonprofit sector would probably know this more, but what I learned, especially kind of joining it and working in my position with a lot of nonprofits, is that, we talk about, a nonprofit will have an executive director. They didn't go to executive director school.
Yeah, totally. I wish that existed.
So the reality is, you find someone, whatever the topic is, someone's worked with youth for a long time, or they've worked with LGBTQ youth for a long time, whatever, and they have the experience that would make them a good leader, but but they don't have financial training necessarily. They don't know how to work with a board. They don't know the policy practices of a board. When you talk about bringing in kind of an inclusive lens to even just board operations, it's like, well, what are board operations to begin with?
What does that even mean?
So when we talk about those like small and medium-sized ones, and those, especially, and this is kind of another thing too, is just there's such a broad range of nonprofit organizations, and even within the community foundations themselves. So when we went to the Community Foundations of Canada conference last year, it was really eye-opening to me, because there's some community foundations, like Winnipeg, for example, they've been around for over 100 years. They're fully staffed with dozens of people. Ours is young. We have around 10 people. We're like just getting to that point of growth. And then you talk to someone else, it's like, well, how many people are at your foundation? Oh, it's me. And I do everything. So I do the communications. I try to run everything. I'm trying to grow it. And it seems like an impossible task. And that's where I could see, having expertise like yours could be really, really valuable, just to help, especially at the grassroots level, help guide those organizations into the right structures to grow and flourish and be able to serve their community in meaningful ways?
Yeah, so we, one of the things that we've done for a while now is we host a bi-weekly, so every 2 weeks we host we call it ED Sask, and it's an online lunch hour Zoom call for executive directors or people who serve in sort of equivalent roles within nonprofits across the province, and that's really just a peer group. And our, my COO, Risa Payat, facilitates that group. And then what we, and that's where really the conference that we hosted, that was sponsored by the Community Foundation last year came from, where we were hearing from EDs, like, I don't have enough opportunity. Like, I don't have ED school. Like I need, I want to connect with other folks. And so that's where that came out of. But that's also where we heard a lot of the need for like executive director or executive coaching from a nonprofit lens and from an equity lens. And I think, so much of, as someone who's tried to access executive coaching in the past, often the people doing executive coaching come from this corporate sector. And that's different. When you start talking about like, your shareholders, like I check out, like that is, that's not necessarily what I'm thinking about. And so I think that that's something that we've been able to offer. And I think, we definitely have dreams around creating some kind of thing like an ED school. But I think that especially when you're in a small nonprofit, you can feel so isolated and alone. And your board often, especially of small organizations, your board doesn't know how to be a board. And doesn't know how to give you the support that you need as an executive director. And so a lot of the work that we do with boards is providing them with the skills to properly supervise their executive director or their staff. Because a lot of the times, in a corporate board structure, the people serving on a corporate board have those financial or legal expertise. And I think as you see larger nonprofits, right, like United Ways or sort of things like that, you'll maybe see that corporate experience on a board. But the people who are serving on the board of like the local animal shelter, they just love animals and they want to help. And if maybe you'll luck out and find an accountant who also loves animals, but odds are like you're developing those skills. And so, and how can we do that when folks are already doing nonprofit work off the side of their desks? And I think that there is some really innovative things that are happening in other parts of the country. That I think funders in particular need to maybe start exploring themselves. Like, so, I think about on a corporate board, people get paid. And I think that there's obviously a lot of, we see that in the corporate world where there's like board members pay themselves a ridiculous salary and then, and then it's, there's corruption that happens. But I think, when I'm running a nonprofit and my board members are effectively paying to serve on my board because of the cost of childcare while they're in their board meeting or the gas it took them to get there or whatever. The fact that I can't offer them $100 for a 3-hour board meeting, that's going to impact who's able to sit on my board, and it's going to impact the skills and expertise that they're able to or willing to bring to me. And so I think that there's some things that are shifting in different subsectors of the, I know that the arts sector, with the arts nonprofit sector, has sort of been shifting away from the more traditional board structure into something different. And I think that there's so many really interesting possibilities and innovations for us that we can consider implementing to create a more inclusive, but also just a more thriving sector.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. When we talk about kind of building that thriving sector, is there any sort of, as we start to wind down, is there kind of one or two tips that you might have for people? Like, is there something that you kind of normally see that needs to be worked on that might be more common?
You know what, I think for me, the really big, especially with small and medium-sized organizations, I think the thing that I often see is either boards who micromanage their staff to the point where their staff can't get anything done because they're telling them what font should be on the poster,
Yeah.
To the opposite, which is boards that are just completely checked out, that just like overwhelmingly trust their executive director, which in some ways is good. And as an executive director, I used to always get angry when my board maybe didn't trust me enough.
Yeah.
But that's like a dangerous, and so I think it's really about, I think the thing that can really help small and medium-sized organizations is developing a strong board that has healthy and respectful boundaries between them and their executive director or their leadership team. And I think that comes with professional development. And there's so many resources on, like, I'm not even like, come pay me to teach you those. Like there are such great resources online that are available for free, that offer board members how to sort of do those things properly. But I definitely think that's one of the major things that I see sort of disrupting or acting as an impediment to the success of so many nonprofits.
Oh, that's great. Well, thanks for that. I think that's a great tip to kind of leave off on, and very relatable to just kind of when you're on a board, is like, what's the right level of involvement and how do we get people involved? And I want to talk to you for like another hour here about this. Unfortunately, we're kind of at our time. So I really appreciate you coming on, giving us a little bit of insights into the nonprofit sector and how you can work. And I hope that this can help inspire some other business owners to think about not just being a business, but being a business that's really community focused. So thanks again for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Victor.
Thanks for tuning in today. If you'd like to learn more about how you can make a difference in your community, visit us online at sscf.ca or check us out on social media on YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, or Instagram. Just search South Sask Community Foundation. I hope you enjoyed the day.
If you'd like to share your feedback on the program you just watched, contact us today.